Two strangers coming into your house at night and killing all the family members present would still be shocking, even today.
We didn't fear anything. I remember riding horses in the sandhills. It was a good place to live.
The Clutters did not lock their doors at night. They didn't expect evil to come to their door.
This isn't something that happens to real people in real life. This can't be real. A death like that and a loss like that, it affects the next generation and the generation after that.
Cold-blooded, the Clutter Family Murders.
What a trailer, man. That's chilling. That's how you can start your Friday right there.
You know, another happy family story by Joe Berlinger.
What draws you to these stories? I mean, what do you love about it?
Well, in general, I've gravitated towards crime because I'm fascinated by crime, but also, you know, I think there's a social justice component to a lot of my crime stuff, you know, like shining a light on injustice with the Paradise Lost series, helping get people out of prison who were wrongfully convicted. This particular one, you know, In Cold Blood, the book, was kind of the granddaddy of the true crime genre that has so exploded today that I wanted to, and the book was incredibly influential to me as a teenager. I remember reading the book in high school as an assignment. It's the first time an assigned piece of literature just blew me away to the point where I went back on my own that summer and read the book like 2 or 3 times under the covers. It chilled me, but it opened my eyes to crime as an amazing way to tell stories. And it also deeply influenced who I am as a filmmaker, because what Truman Capote did with In Cold Blood was he created this new genre of literature called the nonfiction novel, which today we take for granted, but basically it was the first time that a journalist kind of synthesized journalistic technique with novelistic technique to tell a true story, but in a very novelistic way. And I, as a filmmaker, that philosophy deeply imbued in me a sense of what I wanted to do as a filmmaker, because in all of my documentaries, starting with Brothers Keeper that I made with the late Bruce Sinofsky, that film was an exercise in saying, no, we're not making a documentary, we're making a nonfiction feature film. In other words, and we take that granted today as well, that, you know, many documentaries are deeply immersive storytelling experiences, but in the late 80s, early 90s, documentaries were a little more straightforward.
Straightforward, absolutely.
And so like this idea of creating a documentary that has all the fine qualities of narrative fiction, which doesn't mean it's untruthful, but it means taking all the good qualities of narrative structure, an opening title sequence, original music score, all the things that you see in documentaries today weren't that common back then. And with Brothers Keeper, and Bruce, we were consciously evoking Capote and this idea of synthesizing journalism with great storytelling technique. So I've been obsessed with this book for years, and it really influenced who I became as a filmmaker. So the idea, you know, when I pitched it to Sundance, because we knew the 50th anniversary of the book.
So had you been pitching it for a while? Is it something you've wanted to make for a while, or did this opportunity just seem to be the right time?
It seemed to be it's not something I thought about making until I realized that the 50th anniversary of the book and also the movie In Cold Blood by Richard Brooks, their anniversaries were coming up, and the anniversary of Brothers Keeper. Anyone know Brothers Keeper?
Please, guys, see it, absolutely. No, it's a masterpiece, absolutely.
That film is having its 25th anniversary, and this book was having its 50th anniversary. So I thought no better place than Sundance to go pitch this idea of just really doing a deep dive into the original crime and to explore how this kind of launched this whole true crime genre. So it's not something I've always wanted to do. It's a book I've always been obsessed with, but I think this anniversary was kind of the magic number to explore it. And importantly, one of the things we wanted to do, you know, I talk about the social justice aspect of true crime and not just kind of prurient, you know, voyeurism about somebody's tragedy. I think what was important for us to do in this show is to give the family, the victim's family, a voice. Because one of the criticisms of In Cold Blood, a book I revere, from the family, the Clutter family, is that it took these criminals, Perry,
made them the centerpiece, made them the stars.
Dick Hickock and Perry Smith were turned into literary heroes, and that is an unfortunate kind of byproduct of this explosion in true crime. We seem to celebrate the criminal at the expense of the victim, and so this show kind of attempts to tell the victim's story and humanize the victim as opposed to humanizing the killer. Although it's okay to humanize a killer because people are three-dimensional, and to understand how crime happens and how bad things happen, I think you have to see people in 3 dimensions, not 2, but never at the expense of the victim. And I think that's the danger of this genre, and that's what I wanted to kind of focus on.
Absolutely. And what were the questions that you were carrying around for all of these years, the things that you wanted to ask the family, that you finally got to ask through this project?
Well, I think they were very upset about how, in particular, the mother, Bonnie Clutter, was treated in the book. She was treated as someone who was somewhat bedridden and kind of treated as a 2-dimensional character. And so just hearing about the loving family and how they really were, I think gave the family some peace, I hope, or will hope when they see it. And I really wanted to, the town of Holcomb, for example, where this took place in Kansas, they don't want to be known as the place where this terrible murder occurred. They want to be known for lots of things. So I think just giving the community a voice and giving the family a voice, while still exploring the genius of the book and also the genius of the movie that the book was based on, because that's the other thing that was pretty amazing for me as a filmmaker and storyteller. It's rare that you have a book and a movie that are both explosively successful. Usually, the book is great, and then everyone says, oh, the movie adaptation, that was terrible, or the movie was so much better than the book. Here you have a book that's considered a literary classic, In Cold Blood, and then a year later, the movie comes out, In Cold Blood, and that's also was a genre buster that expanded the definition of what cinema could be. In fact, it's so interesting. Richard Brooks, the director who made In Cold Blood, it's one of, location movies were just starting to happen, where you would go on actual location to shoot movies, as opposed to doing it on a backlot or a stage or something like that. So this wasn't the first location movie, but he pushed the authenticity of this film to its nth degree. For example, 7 of the 12 jurors in the actual trial were the jurors in the movie. The crime itself, this horrible murder of 4 members of a family with a shotgun by these home invaders, that crime was shot for the movie in the actual house. So there's a level of authenticity to this scripted film that really impressed me as a maker, and in many ways, in what I do with Brothers Keeper or Paradise Lost, or I have a film opening actually today called Intent to Destroy that hopefully we'll chat about, which is about the Armenian Genocide. But in my films, I try to push documentary to the point where it feels like narrative filmmaking in the sense of its style and how it unfolds. And I think what Richard Brooks was doing was kind of the inverse of that, where he was taking, scripted material and giving it a level of authenticity that you have to almost say, whoa, is this a documentary or is this real? Or is this a scripted film? So I revere both the book and the movie, but I thought it would be an amazing opportunity to put something on Sundance, which is such the right place for this kind of thing, to meditate on, what were the pitfalls of celebrating these guys as literary heroes? What has the true crime genre actually wrought? Because today it's, from Making a Murderer, Serial, Jinx, The Jinx. I've done several true crime series just this year alone. So crime has never been more popular. Don't know why, but it's just, we seem to have a fascination with crime.
Well, I mean, the events were so chilling. I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, they were tied up, they were executed with a shotgun. I mean, it's terrible. What's the most affecting way you've heard it told yourself? I mean, was it that first time you read it in that book, or was it someone recounting it to you as a police report? I mean, how do you go about capturing that or describing that in a program?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I read it, I was horrified, and I remember rereading it literally under my covers as a 15-year-old. because I had never
Flashlight in
I
hand.
had never read anything so devastating. And I think what's great about the show is that even though this is a well-documented crime, and of course it's described in the book In Cold Blood, you know, we do these really high-end recreations, which is something that's rather new to me as a filmmaker. I don't normally work with recreations, but I think our research was so exhaustive, and we got all of these original documents and original resources that haven't been seen before. We were able to retell the crime in this show in a way that it's never been told, like, you know, blow by blow. It's horrifying, obviously, but I also think it's really fascinating to really understand. Because the thing that I came away with, interestingly, is one of the, I don't know if it was the objective, but one of the byproducts of the book was to humanize these killers. Not to condone, but to humanize them, so that by the end of the book or movie or story or real life, by the time those guys are ascending the gallows steps to be hung for their crimes, you have this tremendous human sympathy for them. And interestingly for me, and that I've always had that sympathy, not like, oh, it's okay you did this, but just human empathy that people could go down that path and do such a terrible thing. But doing the show and digging deeply into the actual crime and putting all the pieces together, you know, they came because they thought the safe had 10,000. They heard from a fellow inmate that there was a safe in the house for 10,000 that had $10,000. They drove for hours to get there. There was no safe, and instead of just leaving, you know, they literally executed everyone with a shotgun for no reason. I mean, they walked away with $60 or $70 worth of cash and trinkets. You know, it's famously said in the trial, you know, like $20 a piece, you know, is what they got out of this, and it was brutal. And in doing the show and in recreating the crime and in doing all the research, I actually had a strange feeling come over me, which is I have far less sympathy for these killers than the book gave me, because at the end of their lives and throughout, they really showed no remorse. And, you know, it's one thing to do something terrible and to allow your time in prison to make you realize what you did. Again, there's no excusing any bad act, but I think it's important to view people as three-dimensional human beings. But this show kind of made me feel like, or our work on this show, you know, really made me feel sympathetic towards the family, because they were misrepresented and underrepresented in this famous book. You know, it was the most popular book in its day. It made Truman Capote, for a period of time, like the most celebrated writer in the world. And the movie, too, was very successful, but it was all at the expense of the victims. And so I think that's something we all have to consider when we consume or make true crime.
Absolutely. I mean, living with a story like this, I mean, like Capote did, I mean, he had to wait a few years before the killers were executed, right, to finish his book. Do you, with your projects, are you finding yourself in similar situations where you're waiting for a shoe to drop or waiting for a story to find its conclusion, whether it's a recent project or things you've done in the past?
Yeah, I mean, Capote, this one of the things you learn in the show is the making of this, the writing of this novel tortured him. And in fact, he became an alcoholic and addicted to drugs as a result of the experience, and he never wrote another novel again, and died, you know, I forget the year he died, you know, maybe a decade or so after the book came out. But he was tortured by this because, you know, he started the project in 1959. Because of the appeals process, for anyone on death row, it took, you know, 6 or 7 years for these guys to be executed. And meanwhile, he was developing this very close relationship with the killers, visiting them in prison, in particular with Perry Smith. Capote famously said that, you know, he felt like Perry and he were like brothers, and that, you know, he went out the front door and Perry went out the back door, but he easily, you know, under different circumstances, maybe he would have gone out the back door too, or Perry would have gone through the front door, meaning he would have had a more positive life. But so he developed this affinity for Perry Smith, and yet, in order to complete his project, Smith had to be executed. So he spent 6 or 7 years developing this relationship with this killer on death row at Leavenworth, and had to wait for the execution to happen. And I think that really tortured him because, you know, he was eager and anxious for that execution to happen because he felt he was sitting on literary gold. And once the execution happened, it's like, be careful what you wish for, because now all these personal feelings of his attachment to this guy, started welling up, and I think he had a hard time handling that.
Yeah. Have you developed sort of relationships similar to that? I mean, obviously Paradise Lost, the West Memphis Three, as they became known as,
Yeah.
getting to know those guys. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation?
Yeah, quite a few times. Not quite like that, like waiting for somebody to die. I think the most analogous thing that I could draw was actually when we first went down to do Paradise Lost, which is the story of the West Memphis Three in Arkansas who were wrongfully convicted of these devil-worshipping murders, and we arrived of 3 8-year-old boys, and we arrived right when the arrests happened, 8 months before trial. And when we first went down there, we thought we were making a film about guilty teenagers because all the press was saying these guys were guilty. The police were saying on a scale of 1 to 10, the evidence is an 11. So it seemed like an open and shut case of 3 twisted, devil-worshipping teens who had killed 3 8-year-olds in the woods. And so we thought we were making a film about disaffected youth and how could they become so twisted that they would kill 3 8-year-olds. Halfway through the filming, we became convinced that they were innocent. But prior to that, we were spending most of our time with the victims' families and telling them we were making a film about these rotten teenagers and asking them for access to their story because we thought it would help other families of victims to see what they've gone through, and maybe even by putting this on film, other communities could identify troubled teens who might have the potential to do this. That was what we believed we were making a film about, and that is what we told these victims' families. Halfway through the experience, however, we realized that, no, this is a film about 3 guys who were being wrongfully accused, and then ultimately we covered the trial and they were wrongfully convicted. So when Paradise Lost came out 2 years later, and it was a film about wrongful conviction, 1 guy on death row, 2 guys life without parole, the victims' families in this crime were very upset with us. In fact, they hated us and thought that we had, because, the healing process, I can't imagine losing a loved one through murder, obviously very painful. And the healing process for anyone who's lost somebody through murder is knowing that the perpetrator has been caught and is paying their debt to society. So they felt that this was happening, and so 2 years into the sentences of these guys, our film comes out, which explodes the idea that they're actually innocent, in our opinion, and the family members were extremely upset with us, and for years hated our guts, cursed our names. Eventually, 2 of the 3 families came to believe what we believe, which the West Memphis Three were innocent, and helped us in our 20-year struggle to get them out of prison. But one of the families, who I still respect because I can't imagine the pain that a family goes through, but to this day they believe the West Memphis Three are guilty, accuse us of having manipulated the facts, and have gotten killers out of prison. So that's painful to deal with. In fact, Paradise Lost 3 was nominated for an Oscar and a couple of Emmys, and this family wrote letters to the TV Academy and the Motion Picture Academy asking for our nominations to be stripped because we manipulated the truth and got guilty people out of prison. Now, I'm not mad at them for that because I just, it's painful to go through what they've gone through, but obviously I don't agree. But that's an example of, when you deal with real people's lives and you deal with, tragedy, you have to be very careful about managing people's expectations and feelings, which is why this show, I think, is so special, because we've seen a zillion movies. Bennett Miller made an amazing movie about Truman Capote, obviously the book. There's another biopic about Capote, who's a filmmaker, I apologize, but is also terrific. But I think what's new about this show, what you don't see, is seeing everything through the victim's perspective, and the victim, in this case, the Clutter family, was kind of shunted aside.
I mean, you mentioned the social justice issues. I mean, the Armenian Genocide. I mean, there's no bigger issue really I see out there that isn't being talked about. Tell me what drew you to that cause and how you got connected there.
Yeah. So I have a film coming out today in New York and LA called Intent to Destroy, which is, I go behind the scenes of a big budget Hollywood movie called The Promise, which tells a similar story. It's a love story set against the backdrop of the Armenian Genocide. For people who don't know, because a lot of people don't know in this country, unfortunately, in 1915, under the cover of World War I, the Ottoman Turkey rounded up from 1915 to 1923 1.5 million Armenians, 85% of the population, and eliminated them in a genocide. And to this day, it's disputed as contested history because Turkey pressures allies like America to not tell that story. And so this film confronts that head on. After World War I ended, the Western powers decided they wanted Turkey as a friend, both for oil resources of the former Ottoman Empire. They wanted access to those resources. And in subsequent decades, like during the Cold War, Turkey has such a strategic importance where it's located, geographic importance. America uses bases in Turkey during the Cold War, or used to listen in on Russia. In more recent times, we launch bombing missions into the Middle East during our misadventures in multiple Middle Eastern wars to do bombing. So nobody wants to offend Turkey, but Turkey does want to acknowledge that they committed a genocide against Armenian Christians during the First World War.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great way to tell the story using that big budget film with Christian Bale, Oscar Isaac,
Yeah.
and you're filming these scenes take place while they're recreating what actually happened, the actual events,
Yeah.
and then actually delving into the history too. Is that a purposeful choice? I mean, how'd you make that decision?
Well, most of my films are more. Interestingly, both Intent to Destroy and Cold Blooded are historical shows with talking heads, interviews, and archival footage, and both I think turned out great. But normally I'm a cinema verite filmmaker, in which I like to follow stories that are unfolding and you don't know where the outcome is. So the idea of just doing a historical piece about the genocide without some present tense thread, I felt would be a little boring for audiences. So to go behind the scenes of a big budget movie that's attempting to tell the story, I felt was a good creative choice, so that people can, in between hearing all the history, they can experience, what it's like to go behind the scenes of a big movie with big movie stars. But more importantly, the choice to go behind the scenes of The Promise was connected very much to the fact that my documentary is not just about the Armenian genocide itself, but the century-long denial campaign that has been so effective that anytime Hollywood has attempted to make a movie about the Armenian genocide, the Turkish government calls up our State Department, and our State Department, to appease this strategic ally, twists the arm of the Hollywood studio to drop the project. So there's never been a movie coming out of Hollywood that is Armenian genocide themed. It'd be like taking Steven Spielberg aside and whispering into his ear, hey, don't make Schindler's List because we need to keep the Nazis happy, I mean, it's almost equivalent to that, I would say. But in this instance, finally a movie was coming out of Hollywood that was Armenian genocide, but not out of a Hollywood studio, because a Hollywood studio still would not make this movie today, but rather it was independently financed, but had a lot of Hollywood players in it. So I thought, if I embed with the movie and tell the story of the making of the movie, it allows me to not just tell the story of the genocide itself, but also how denial in Hollywood and censorship in Hollywood on this particular story has worked all these decades.
Well, I could easily keep talking to you, but I think I have to throw the audience for some questions. There we go.
Hello. You were just speaking about the film you created where the family of the victims did not like you or the film after it was made. I have two questions. Were you in close contact with the family while you were creating the film? And how do you personally handle that as a filmmaker when the family does not appreciate the film that you've created?
Good question. We were, while the film was being made, we decided it would not be good strategy to tell either side how we were feeling, because we wanted to remain neutral in our reporting. After the film was finished and before it came out, we contacted the families to let them know it was coming out and to let them know what our point of view was, and that's when the anger started happening. How we manage that, it's tough. You have to, on the one hand, you have to be very sympathetic, and you have to be empathetic, and you have to treat people that you're telling their story like it's a great privilege, because it is. But when you get into the editing room, you have to put your blinders on and not let personal feelings get in the way of the truth. You have to get the truth out. And in this instance, after spending a year on the story, we felt there were 3 people in prison for a crime they didn't commit, one of whom was on death row, and that we had a moral obligation to the truth, even if that hurt people's feelings. And so knowing you're going to hurt people's feelings in a very profound way, you just have to steel yourself and just always know, you know, if you're doing it for self-aggrandizement, if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, if you're telling a manipulative story, those, you know, that's not good. But if you're there to tell the truth about people who've been wrongfully convicted, in this example, you just have to steel yourself for the criticism because you have a larger mission.
Great. Next question.
Hi. So with the other thing you were talking about with Cold-Blooded, since you were able to adapt that into television, was it more gratifying doing something for TV than for film, or was it kind of the same for you?
That's a good question. You know, I like doing both. You know, with TV, a lot more people see it more quickly, and I think viewing habits have changed. I mean, we're in a golden age of television right now, so it's great to do stuff for TV that lots of people see. Nonetheless, I got into filmmaking for that communal experience of people sitting in a movie theater and watching you're watching something, because I think particularly a film that's about social justice or about some aspect of the human condition, there's something magical that happens when you watch it with a group of people, and so I often miss that now that I do more TV than films that actually go into the movie theaters. But you know, it's a sign of the times. I mean, people are looking at films on their iPhones. Netflix, Amazon, all these streaming platforms have given huge opportunities for increased storytelling because there's just more people and more watching and more channels and more ways. But I do miss that theatrical thing that happens when 100 people or 200 or whatever are sitting in the same room watching something. But unfortunately, you know, movie tickets are going up in price, and Hollywood seems to like to make just giant comic book blockbuster sequels, and you know, I think what's happening is that in movie theaters, the films that really are working are only those really big event movies where you can, you know, I mean, tickets in New York now are like $19 or something.
It's not cheap, that's for sure.
I mean, I mean, like for a young couple to go to the movies and hire a babysitter, it's like, you know, ridiculous. So, and instead you can just watch it, you know, streaming or something. So it's a shame. I think theatrical entertainment has changed so drastically in the last 10 or 15 years. But I'm glad there's opportunities like on Sundance to do stuff that lots of people see.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question.
In Intent to Destroy, 102 years later, after the fact, it's very difficult to get firsthand witnesses at any age that would be relevant to historic accuracy. What kind of historic documents or people do you speak to in order to maintain your truth?
That's a good question. Well, luckily, at the 12th hour, we uncovered a whole cache of archival interviews that were done by a guy named J. Michael Hagopian, Dr. Hagopian, and he had created this thing called the Armenian Film Foundation. And so we have in the film survivor interviews of people who survived the genocide. These were shot in the 70s and 80s, but we got access to them. So you do hear from survivors. It wasn't shot by me, but it's in the film. And we've also had, you know, did an exhaustive amount of research, and we have a tremendous amount of documents. But one of the funny things, funny in quotation marks, things about this story is it's not as unknown as the deniers would like to make you think. Back in the day, in 1915, there was over 146 headlines in the New York Times, articles in the New York Times about the slaughter of the Armenians. And there was the largest relief effort known to man up until that point was this thing called the Near East Relief Effort, and that was specifically created to help Armenians who were being murdered. And so one of America's finest hours back then was this selfless fundraising and philanthropy towards the Armenian issue back in the day. Babe Ruth's 50th home run bat was auctioned off for Armenian charities. There are all sorts of examples of people really knowing this story. And yet after World War I, it was decided to bury this story with American complicity. And so not only do we not know about, does the average American not know about the Armenian Genocide, we also don't know that there was actually a time in our history where we were incredibly generous towards these people. So we do have lots of great historical stuff, but if you dig into the history, it's not that hard to see the truth. And it's, it sounds like, well, who cares about something that happened 102 years ago? We live in an age of alternative facts and fake news, and we have an administration that just tells you things and tells you things and tells you things that you're just supposed to accept as truth. And that's how denial happens, is you just have an alternative narrative that you just say it over and over again until people become so confused by what the truth is. And we live in very dangerous times, I think, where we're just hearing multiple sides of issues and we're not really getting the truth about a lot.
Well, it's a powerful piece of work. Intent to Destroy is in theaters right now, and then Cold-Blooded hits Cold-Blooded.
Yeah, November
Clutter
18th
Family.
and 19th on Sundance
9
at
p.m.
9 p.m. And for those in New York, we're doing a Q&A at City Cinemas after the 7 o'clock show. If people want to go to the 7 o'clock show, you can hear me pontificate even more.
I'd love to do that myself personally. Give him another round of applause,
All right,
guys.
thank you.
Joe Berlinger.
All right, thank you.